Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. I'm Dr. Richard Bulzacchelli, lecturer in theology at Catholic Studies Academy, in for Jason Gale. And I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith, our lecturer in philosophy. Today we'll be talking about the mystery of death from various philosophical and theological perspectives. Now, before we get started, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and select notifications. And of course, share this content with your friends. So, Dr. Smith, why don't you get us started? Everyone's aware of death. So naturally, the ancient Greek philosophers must have had something to say about it, no?
Absolutely, yeah. It's interesting, when I was going through undergraduate, I don't know if you experienced this or not. There was kind of a little bit of a little bit of a boom, I guess you might say, of people talking about death and dying. I remember there being some philosophy classes about that.
Yeah.
I think that was kind of relatively good move, because it's one of those topics that, obviously, you say, hey, let's get together and have a conversation about death, right? Like a lot of people would be like, no, thanks, but, in fact, we know we're going to die,
Yeah.
which is an interesting fact about the human experience, about the human condition, really, right? That death is something, we know it's out there and it's going to happen. And, the older you get, the more funerals you go to. And, you see like, this is a reality. We come to an end, right?
Yeah.
It's really almost, it's kind of hard to imagine that, I think, psychologically, right? That, at some point, just speaking from maybe a physical point of view, you come to a full stop, right? Like it just, I mean, if you were a strict materialist, right, your conception would be that you go and then boom, there's nothing. Like it's just done. It's not like you're in a void even, or asleep or anything like that. It's just not, right? And it's hard, of course, for us to imagine that, because in imagining it, we're still there, right?
Yeah, right.
But anyways, it's an important fact. I think it conditions a lot of things about us. You think about the human life cycle. We're aware of there being a human life cycle, and that it comes to an end. And so, it has been a topic of serious philosophical reflection, starting the ancient Greeks and through a lot of different philosophers. Socrates, in the early Socratic dialogues, we get a really interesting claim by Socrates that says actually that philosophy is preparation for death, right? Sometimes some of my undergraduate students will say, yes, it is. Right? Like, yeah, this really is preparing me to die. But, of course, Socrates' interlocutor is asking what he means by that. And what he has to say, right, is, of course, Socrates is very grounded in the idea that philosophy is a way of life, right? The philosopher, you become a philosopher, a lover of wisdom, and that affects who and what you are, and the way you act. Certainly it did Socrates' own life, right? Socrates lived a very unusual life and remarkable to his peers. Like his peers knew him and thought of him as a remarkable man, right? And some of them loved him and some of them hated him, right?
Yeah.
But obviously, since he was put to death by Athens. But, what he's saying there is that really philosophy detaches us from temporal goods, I would say, right? Or from a strong dependence upon them. Now, he actually, in some texts, I think, takes this fairly puts this fairly strongly, in the sense that he, thinks of happiness as virtue and virtue as knowledge, right? And so that you can, the Stoics and the Cynics pick up on this idea from Socrates that really, you can be bereft of all temporal goods and happy, right? I mean, that's the kind of Socratic view, and that the philosopher wisdom teaches you that, right? That you can be happy with almost nothing, right? That now I think Aristotle has a more moderate view, right, as far as that goes. But certainly that comes across in Socrates. And the idea is that really we are immortal souls, or as he says, in the I think it's the Phaedo, where he says, we should at least believe that we are, which is an interesting caveat, right? It's better for us to believe and act as if this is true, right? Maybe maybe he's not 100% sure in those early dialogues, Socrates, but we should at least live this way. And what that has to do with is recognizing that since we're immortal souls, that's who and what we are. The body is just, it's not completely unimportant, but it's a thing to be ruled over, right?
uh,
And it's an instrument, and the goods that attach to it are temporary and fading, right? Whereas the goods of the soul are not temporary and fading, right? They are immortal, right? And so when he's talking about this idea of preparation for death, death for a Platonist is not all, is not, I mean, I'm not aware of any Platonists advocating suicide or anything crazy like that. They do seem to have the view that, you have something to do in this life that's important, but that really death is sort of a release from the
yeah,
temporal world of change and pain and all those
right.
things into
I
a
think
more natural state for the soul,
the
right?
way
Which,
I would characterize the Platonist view, right, is that I would say that they think that we really ought not to exist in the body, but in
right,
fact we do,
sure,
and they try to understand like how it comes to be, right? How it
sure.
is that a thing that shouldn't exist in the body does exist in the body.
Hmm.
Um, and so you look at some of the different myths that Plato appealed to,
Right,
right,
sure.
in his dialogues.
Uh-huh.
And he's talking about, there's the one about the unruly steed,
Hmm.
where they're circling around. We really belong in heaven, right? Following the
Hmm.
trains of the gods. And we're circling around it. This is the eternal form, the circle, right? So we're going
Hmm.
around following the god. And then there's this unruly aspect of our souls or something,
Right. Uh-huh.
right? In the form of the one steed that wants to pull off on a tangent.
Hmm.
And because of this, right, they lose their feathers, the steeds, and eventually they crash down to the earth. And that's how we end up in the material body.
Right.
But Plato probably doesn't really believe this legend is literal, right?
Sure.
But I mean, it's a way of thinking about this, that something's gone wrong, and
Hmm.
the project in this life is to kind of change the way our soul relates to the body that is in, to the material
Hmm.
world.
Hmm. Right.
So
Right.
that it's prepared to be liberated from it,
That's right. That's right.
right?
That's a way of putting it. Hmm.
I think many Platonists might suggest that there's a kind of reincarnation that
Right.
might
Yeah.
occur
Hmm.
if you don't succeed at that.
Hmm. Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. That's a great way of putting it. Live so as to die, so as to be liberated. Right. And so that includes, right, a detachment from worldly things, a detachment from the pleasures of the body, a detachment from temporal glory, those sorts of things. And certainly there's some things there that seem correct, right?
Uh,
Insofar as from a philosophical perspective, there is a sense that you're mortifying the flesh, right? Is one way to put it. It sounds very New Testament, but you're mortifying, right, certain desires, right, um, in such a way that you're preparing to kind of go through this liberation of death and ultimately
mhm.
be freed and return home, right? I like the way Plotinus talks about it. He talks about returning to the fatherland.
Yeah.
It's fantastic imagery. So I mean, living your life as open to an eternal perspective, right? As open to a perspective that you will continue on, right? That you will continue forever, and that the way you live in this life affects, right, what's going to happen afterwards, right?
Right. Right.
I mean, those pieces seem to me laudable. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. I think at this stage in the development of thought, right?
Right.
I think people have reached a level of real insight, right?
Hmm.
Now, I would want to push further. Obviously, in the end, I think the Christian understanding of things is going to be the best solution to this problem of death.
Hmm.
But I mean, I want to credit the ancients for what they thought. And one of the things,
Hmm.
I mean, there of course there are lots of different views about what happens after this life in the ancient world, long before there was
Sure.
any sort of sophisticated Greek philosophy, right?
Hmm.
But I think there are some real insights. It seems to me there are real insights for the ancient Greeks in terms of this sort of the way in which they the way in which they think of what the purpose of this life
Hmm.
is really, right?
Yeah.
That there's something, this life is, the condition we're in now is a temporary condition.
Hmm.
Whatever, whatever else you might say, right? Everyone
Right.
recognizes that this condition is temporary. So the question
Right.
is, do I live as if this life is futile? It has no meaning, right?
Hmm.
There's no purpose to it. That was
Right.
one tendency that we find in the ancient world. And you see that reflected, for example, in Ecclesiastes, right?
Hmm.
If we live in a world without God,
Hmm.
then life is meaningless.
Hmm.
It's only God that makes life really meaningful.
Hmm.
Um, and then, of course, we also have views like in ancient Egypt, where their best case scenario, right, for life after death
Hmm.
is that you end up in exactly the same situation that you're in right now, except it won't be temporary anymore, right?
Hmm.
So they recognize the temporariness of life, of this life,
All right.
and they do. I think they do see something about the way we live it as connected to what happens afterwards. After this life, we pass through these various scrutinies, right?
Hmm.
For the ancient Egyptians, and if we manage to pass them, a question which the answer to that question is determined largely by the way we conducted ourselves in
Okay.
this life, right?
Hmm.
Then we get to the other side and we get everything back,
Okay.
but no longer with the risk of losing it. But that's the
Interesting.
best case scenario, right?
Right. Sure. It's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. That's interesting. One of you wonder how that would make you. I guess that would make you think. Well, I need to live well enough, right?
Uh,
To get back the goods of this life. But it does seem to me to fall short, right? I mean, the Platonist seems better here in this sense that, or Socrates, that it's a really different kind of
yeah,
existence,
right,
right? Like there's a
right,
new you're pivoting to a higher form of yourself, a better form of yourself, a better form of existence,
yeah.
right? Um,
But do you think where do you think the point of intersection is and the point of departure is between this Platonist view and say what you might find in Hinduism or Buddhism?
mhm. Oh,
What do you think about that?
that's really interesting. I think that the reincarnation part, right? So a lot of
Uh,
Platonists do have that reincarnation view, right? That if you don't live well, you'll be reincarnated. Um, let's see here. I think it's been a little bit since I've been really reading that stuff, but um, life is suffering
yeah.
in the Hindu and Buddhist tradition. It's a thing to be overcome and gotten out of. And you can see some convergence there, parallelism with Plato. There is some interesting work that's been done that suggests at least the possibility of some um, interaction between some of the
Uh,
Greeks and maybe early Indian thought. That's pretty thin right now, but it is interesting. But in any case, I think the real difference though is that Plato is not a monist,
yeah.
and the Hindus really are monist, and so really. your individuality is reabsorbed
Yeah,
into,
right,
right,
right. Yeah.
this ultimate reality that is the one. Whereas I think for Platonists, it's, the souls really are individual,
Yeah.
and so whatever Platonic heaven is like, right?
You're self-conscious, self-aware, right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. It's your individuality and sense of distinction, right?
Uh-huh.
Not false. And that's not something to be overcome. Whereas I think for
I think
Hinduism,
that's a major, major difference
sure. Yeah. I mean, I think,
but so I mean it's funny because like on the surface, if you're just sort of listening to,
mm,
you live this life in such a way so you don't have to get recycled in reincarnation
mm,
again,
mm,
and you just sort of detach from this world and all this. That sounds very similar, right? They sound that sounds a lot like Hinduism and Buddhism,
sure.
but it's not, and it's not because of
Mm,
the focus on how we understand self distinction,
yeah. Right.
right?
Yeah.
So
I
in
think,
Hinduism and Buddhism, that's a bad thing, right? Self
mm,
distinction is a sort of aberration of being,
that's right. Yeah.
but not so for Platonism.
That's right. And it's interesting, one of the Western thinkers who uh, kind of brought together Buddhism and German idealism, strange, right? Is
Uh,
Schopenhauer, right? And Schopenhauer very clearly has this, animus against individuality. Individuality is a deception, right? What we really are is all just, will, this one undifferentiated will,
mhm,
which is not the Hindu version exactly, of course. But I think actually, Rich, that the metaphysical division between pluralist and monist is
uh,
actually something we probably in metaphysics allied over too quickly. Like, when we do our metaphysics classes and things like that, I think because, monism is such a powerful metaphysical system
uh,
historically and culturally. I mean, you
yeah,
think
yeah,
about the
right.
world, in
Like
global
half the
terms.
world actually
Yeah,
adheres to
right.
it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you put China and India together. I mean, like, that's a lot of monists,
Yeah,
right?
right,
You
right.
know, and so uh, the fact that we opted for pluralism over monism as a cult, as a Western, as a civilization, right?
Mhm.
Um, is was I think important, and a real gain, and it ties into the ways you think about death, right? So when you could think about death just as this dissolution of the illusion of individuality, right? And that's a great thing, or
Yeah,
think about it as a transference to a higher kind of um, existence, like Socrates does. On the other end of the spectrum, Rich, would be this slogan you hear lots of times now from modern atheists: this is your only life, enjoy it, right? This is
yeah,
the life you get, enjoy it. And it's where you don't have to be a Christian to have a different view than that, right? You could be a Hindu or you could be Socrates, right?
right, right,
And
right.
Socrates can say, well, actually, what's interesting is Socrates says, even if it's not true that we continue on, it's better to live as if that were the
The
truth.
quality of life that you live will be a better quality
That's right.
of
That's
life,
right.
right?
And that's William James, pragmatist argument,
Yeah,
right,
right.
as well, is that he's like, I'm not 100% sure that free will and immortality are true, but I think it's better for me to live as if it were, right?
Uh,
Um, and I think that would be an interesting argument to have in existential terms, right? Like, why is it that it's better to live as if you were going to have an afterlife? Why does the atheist think, no, it's better not to think about that? I mean, certainly Nietzsche, right? One of his criticisms of Christianity and Platonism is the belief in life after death, right? He
yeah,
thinks that
right.
actually poisons us so that
Uh,
we don't truly engage in this life.
yeah, we
And
hold back, right?
that's right. That's right. Yeah. From really exercising the will to power, because we have this sort of fantasy life about a permanent sense of being that we're going to sort of ascend to.
One of the criticisms that's made in the Nietzschean vein, right, against
Mm,
Christians, and you'll hear this criticism made today, is that the belief in the afterlife actually prevents us from taking any meaningful action to make the world we're living in now a better place, right?
That's
Because
great.
the idea is that we'll just kind of, this life doesn't mean anything. It doesn't matter
Hmm.
if there are bad things in this world. We just accept that that's the case, and so we'll just die and get over it, right?
Right.
Um, Now, I mean, obviously, anybody who knows anything about Christianity knows that's a complete perversion
Sure.
of our moral view, right?
Hmm.
But that is in the Nietzschean vein. That's kind of the criticism.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, yeah, I think so. I mean, that's kind of the more serious and moralistic sounding, right?
Uh,
Kind of criticism. Whereas, you could also have what I was kind of proposing there was kind of the more hedonistic one, right? Which is, like this belief in the afterlife is keeping you from doing things that you should do, right? So one thing you might say is, as belief in the afterlife has declined, the willingness of people to do the right thing, even when it includes suffering, has decreased. What do you think about that?
yes, I absolutely think that's right. I see no question,
Yeah,
right? I
like
mean, like,
like sticking to your word, keeping your vows,
well, there's
those
an
sorts of
exception
things.
to every rule now, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, if you just think about, it's the death of the idea of the absolute moral norm,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? That makes sense, right?
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
and you see this even among professing Christians. The idea
Mm.
that life under certain conditions um, is is unlivable within the confines of the moral ideals of
Right.
Christianity, and we
Right.
would,
Right.
right. So they're just ideals.
Mm.
They're not principles.
Sure. Sure. We
That
can't.
language is dangerous when we see that language, right? What's dangerous about it is, I mean, there are different ways you could mean it, I guess,
Hmm.
but one way in which I definitely, I mean, keep in mind, as a teacher, right, as
Hmm.
somebody who has been teaching for a long time at different academic levels, when people hear the word ideal or use the word ideal,
Sure.
right,
Sure. Yeah.
they often think of an unattainable goal, a
Hmm.
sort of like, it would be nice if, wouldn't it be
Right.
great? And we'll try
Right.
to approximate it, but
Sure.
we
Yeah.
know we can't ever reach it,
Hmm.
which is a concept that, from a moral perspective, right, tends to presuppose that lots of compromise will happen in
Hmm.
in the practical sphere.
Right. Yeah. 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 That's a good point. Um, yeah.
So
It's
in Veritatis
interesting. Yeah.
Splendor, right? In
Yeah.
Veritatis
Yeah.
Splendor, Pope John Paul II talks about martyrdom, and
There you go.
sometimes he says that sometimes that's the only response a Christian can give while doing the right thing,
Hmm.
right? So
Hmm.
basically, in other words, in order to live, sometimes the moral principles
Hmm.
of that Christians live by, right? The
Hmm.
absolute moral norms demand
Hmm.
that we do not do X or that we do
Sure.
Y,
Right. Hmm.
right? No matter what the consequence to us.
Right.
And that will mean we will die.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And obviously that wouldn't make any sense, right? Outside of the context of an afterlife, right?
Yeah.
The idea that
Like, I don't think Aristotle, I'm not sure, I don't think Aristotle would agree
hmm
with
hmm
that view.
I think he would say that there are times where that the virtuous man, there are times where he has to hazard his life, right? Aristotle would say that, I think,
Uh,
for sure, because of war and the
yeah.
duties of a citizen. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think martyrdom would be a different question.
Uh,
He might have told Socrates, "You should have just run."
yeah. Right. Right. Right.
Like,
Right.
I mean, there are times. I mean, even when I'm reading it, was that the Credo? I think, is that right?
Uh,
I would think maybe you should have just left, But he has his argument that's really interesting about the laws of the city and who he is as an Athenian. But yeah, so I think that that's true. But even I think less than martyrdom, just say the willingness to put up with an unhappy situation in life.
Yeah,
You
right.
know,
To
um,
endure it. Well, it is. See, I see that as a form of martyrdom, right?
sure,
It's not red martyrdom,
sure,
right, by blood, but it's
mm,
martyrdom. It's a kind of white martyrdom, right, where
right.
you give up the only life that the world thinks you have,
That's right. Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
You give it up for the sake of the absolute moral norms that you value.
That's right. Yeah, yeah, that's key. Um, so the another. So we've focused here so far really on thinking about afterlife and the way that living in this life gets you to a better state, right? A higher
Yeah,
form of being. That's represented in the Platonist tradition. That we would say that in a certain way, in a certain respect, that's runs parallel to the Christian view.
uh,
Um, a somewhat different take on it, I think you get in the Stoics, and as you know, I'm very interested in the Stoics, and I'm always trying to increase my understanding of them. One of the reasons is that I think that they have had a unappreciated impact on early Christianity.
yeah,
I think scholars have gone on good ways of improving that situation, right? That is
uh,
recognizing that actually Stoicism did have a huge impact in early Christianity. But I think there had been before that maybe a tendency to just focus on the Neoplatonic sort of
yeah,
tradition. um, and then also just as interesting philosophers in their own right, and interesting in the sense that they were really one of the most popular forms of philosophy. I think oftentimes until recently, I would say, Stoics were tended to have a pretty bad reputation, seemed to be pretty unattractive, but really, in truth, in the ancient world, they were more popular than really any of the forms of philosophy that have other forms of ancient philosophy that have come down to us. So you really have to think about them, especially in Rome, as kind of a popular movement, which I think is really interesting. And you start looking at their morality, especially their sexual morality, very different than a lot of their interlocutors,
yeah,
and their willingness to do things like recover abandoned infants, right? Which is a very
yeah,
strange
right.
thing to do in the
Christians,
ancient world.
Christians, of course, definitely did that, right,
Right, right.
in the primitive church. But the Stoics did it too,
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
you
so
know,
they're interesting in that way, right?
right, right. In fact, I think you can say, right, that if you don't think of Stoicism so much as a properly religious perspective,
Yeah,
and just think of it as a sort of ethical paradigm,
sure.
then I think you can actually say, right, that many of the early Christians uh, and Jews of that time were actually Stoics,
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you think that
right?
Paul?
That
Do you
they,
think that Paul was? I know
what's
that
that?
there's some scholarship out there. Do you think that Paul was a Stoic, a Jewish Stoic?
I'm not 100% sure that I would say that. I think
Okay.
he definitely had strong sympathies. I
Mm,
would say though I would say that Cyril of Alexandria is a Stoic,
okay, gotcha.
right?
Interesting. Yeah.
I mean, he emphasizes, for example, he emphasizes apatheia,
Mm-hmm. Sure.
right? Which is their sort of it's literally what it means is being without passion,
Mm-hmm.
right? And of course, there were different versions of this, right? There,
Sure.
not all Stoics have the same exact view,
Right.
but for some, it was pretty radical. And
Mm-hmm.
there's debate about what Cyril's position was on this,
Mm-hmm.
but when I read Cyril, I kind of think it's the harsher view.
Yeah.
Anyway, the softer view, right, of apatheia, one which I think is taken up like pretty much completely into Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
is the view that the passions cannot be permitted to govern the
Mm-hmm.
person,
Right.
but
Right.
instead the person has to govern his passions by reason.
Mm-hmm.
That basically reason is to rule in the person, and the passions are to be sort of tamed and shaped by what's rational.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Uh,
Um, I would
yeah.
say Augustine holds that view,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
Thomas certainly holds that view,
Mm-hmm.
but other Stoics, they held the view that that basically passion is bad.
Mm,
That passion is just is intrinsically problematic and
yeah,
subhuman.
yeah. I mean, I think part of the issue there for them is that, for one thing, they see virtue as happiness, right?
Uh,
And so they have that stronger Socratic view rather than the Aristotelian view. So like that, you could cut your arms being cut off, but you're virtuous, you're fine, right?
yeah.
No real harm has been done to you. Um, you know, and from a certain point of view, you could kind of like, I mean, there are aspects of Christian spirituality that kind of slightly push in that direction.
Oh yeah. Like you could.
So you can find that. I mean, that's a pretty radical way to think, right? By
Uh,
cutting off my arm, but I'm fine because I'm being virtuous. Like maybe I'm a soldier or whatever.
Paul uses that imagery, right? Paul
Sure.
does use that imagery,
Yeah. Yeah.
and in fact, he says there's that famous line where he says, "I have learned, I have learned in whatever condition I find myself in life, therewith to be content."
That's right.
Um, and that's a very stoic kind of sentiment,
Sure.
right?
Yeah, it really
Or
is.
if I live, I live for Christ. If I die, I
Mhm.
die for Christ, right? I mean, whether I live or die is of no
Sure.
account.
Yeah. 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 So it's
Cool,
really,
right?
yeah.
Or Ignatius of Antioch, who's like, yeah, I mean, don't save me. Don't try to interfere. I want to get
That's
eaten
right.
by the
I want to
lions.
be eaten by the lions, right? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's pretty radical, right? Stance, both Christian or Stoic. And I think with the Stoics, right? So that's going to consist in right the rule of reason, right?
uh,
Um, the rule really of like for the Greek Stoics of logos, right? Um, we're going to use a different term in Latin, right, for the Roman Stoics, but it really is that, and that's because that's a little bit. This is where the Stoics are different, right? That's a little bit of God, right? Basically, right? There's a little bit of that logos in us, right?
mhm,
Is the most divine, right? Part of us, and that's the part that flows back to sort of kind of cosmic logos in the when we die, right? Um, but the passions, right? They interfere with the rule of logos,
yeah,
right?
right.
So it's not just sort of some sort of like weird antipathy to emotions. It's a recognition that they're a problem for the rule of reason, right?
Yeah, right.
So but anyways, I think
But
that
I
can
think, well, see, that's a place though where Christianity does have a point of departure, right?
sure.
Um, and that's because of the way in which it conceptualizes the relationship between soul and body.
Hmm. Hmm.
Whereas in Christianity, there's a resurrection of the body, right? And
Right,
there were
right.
early heretics who didn't accept that view,
Interesting. Yeah.
right? So we can say, for example, the Docetists,
Hmm.
the Manicheans, right?
Right.
They didn't accept the view that the body is in fact properly part of the person. They held a strongly dualistic metaphysic where
Hmm.
body and soul are separate,
Yeah.
right? That
This
they
that makes the Stoics really interesting there, right? Because they seem to be materialist, right? They seem to basically have the view that the soul is a substance,
uh,
right? And a substance that's like fire is what they'll say, as the best image, right? And also that logos, right? This is interesting though because of some of the language in the New Testament too, right?
yeah,
But
yeah,
that logos is fire, right?
uh,
And so one of the images, when they talk about the world being consumed by fire, what it really means the world being consumed by logos, right?
uh,
Right. Which is really fascinating, a picture of it. But yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah, there. But it is interesting to think about the fact that they have this view, but they're materialists. I can't really fathom the idea of the soul being material and being soul. Like it's hard for me to
yeah. I
conceptualize.
sort of can, because
Yeah.
I think if you go back to the ancient world, right, you can see that for go back to ancient polytheism, right?
Hmm.
Um, for many of the ancient polytheists, the gods
Yeah.
had they were part of the cosmos, right? I mean,
Sure. Yeah,
they weren't
that's a good point.
outside of it.
That's a good
And
point.
so what you had was different sort of modes of being within the cosmos.
Hmm.
One of them we call matter, and the other
Hmm.
we call spirit.
Hmm.
But um, but they're really just spirit is just a rarefied form of being. This
Sure.
so to wrap your head around it, right? I think you might look at contemporary paranormal researchers, right?
Okay.
The people who go around with like electronic instruments and try to find ghosts.
Yeah.
So if you think of the soul as a spiritual being that is not like it's not material in the way that other material in the way that say light is material
Sure.
or electromagnetic energy is material.
Uh-huh.
Um, but electromagnetic energy is not material the way my cup is, right? Or
Sure. Yeah, that's true.
the way my body is. Um, so the way they would have conceptualized in the ancient world, I think the way many of them would have conceptualized the way in which the gods exist
Hmm.
would be more akin to
Hmm.
the physical forces or electromagnetic energy or
Yeah,
something.
that's interesting. And that's actually kind of that sort of way of thinking about physical reality, especially when you get down to like quantum mechanics and things like that.
Uh,
It's very hip on the new age side of things, right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, new age kind of spiritualities very often bring in those energies,
yeah,
right?
right.
And words like that that are kind of pseudo-scientific, I guess.
Hmm.
You know,
Right. So, but Christianity is starting from a different perspective
that's
in
right.
this way, right?
Hmm.
That we worship a God who isn't part of the cosmos,
Key point. Key point. Yeah.
right? And so, no matter what we might say about anything else, about the pagan gods, we could grant
uh,
that pagan gods are real entities,
uh,
and maybe they exist within the frame of the cosmos. Maybe the
mm,
angels do. Maybe there's something sort of quasi-material about the angels. That was a debate in the Middle Ages, right?
sure.
Do the angels have any sort of body or not?
Hmm.
Um, but we can't debate whether God exists in that way.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's of course what makes the that's what makes the incarnation such a
Yeah. So,
radical kind of claim.
right. So strange. Yeah. So and it's a very important. I remember one of my professors, Monsignor Sokolowski, when I was at Catholic University of America, used to call that the Christian distinction. Right, is that God
Uh,
is not God is not the highest part of the world. God
right.
is entirely outside the world, and I think that does sort of get us towards thinking about sort of that does reshape and reframe, right, the way that we're gonna as Christians approach death, say vis-a-vis the Stoics, right? One of the main ways it seems to me that the Stoics approach it, which tied into their materialism but also their providentialism, is their view is that they use it as an exercise, right? That is, they want you to think about death, right? Remember that you will die, right? So Epictetus has in his
Yeah.
handbook, he's got this little phrase, and you can actually find this in Catholic churches and stuff
Uh,
too.
uh,
But it's contextualized differently, but memento mori, right? That
yeah.
remember that you're going to die, right? And that all of this is going to go away. And of course, the things that are in the Epictetus handbook, I really recommend that if you're interested in kind of just diving into the Stoics. It's the kind of thing you could read over a week very easily, just 10 minutes, 15 minutes in the morning or something like that. And it's really meant to be, I kind of think devotional literature is about the closest, like it's meant to be material for meditation, right?
Yeah.
And reflection, right? So that you read it, you say it to yourself, and that's going to help you get sort of lined properly, right? So that you'll do your duty and live out logos in the right way. But it's this idea that thinking about death helps us to live well in this life, right? So, from a Stoic perspective, right? So that what they're worried about is the passions attaching you to things that draw you away from your duty and the rule of logos within yourself, right? And so
Mm.
that's what they want you to think about when they think about death. You're going to die. Your wife is going to die. All of your glories are going to die, right? All of you, like, you see what I'm saying? Like all of the, like when you're like, say you're, this is especially Rome, right? Because in Rome, the Romans loved glory, right? And they're trying to say to their fellow Romans, don't love glory because you're going to die and you will not have that gift, that benefit, right? So don't worry about that side of it, right? Just worry about what's permanent, and that's the logos within you. What
Yeah,
do you think about
right.
that, Rich?
Yeah. So again, I think that Christianity would largely adopt that view
Mm-hmm.
um, as far as the conduct of my personal life goes, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they would say we shouldn't be concerned about the affairs of men.
Sure.
And I don't think the Stoics really thought that either, right?
Yeah, they really kind of thought about it sort of as, what is your place?
Yeah,
Right.
right.
So if you're, now this is what's weird, and I think I disagree with some people about this, but I think in the New Testament, right, you get a lot of the similar view where, you can be a Christian and you can be a slave. You can be a Christian
Uh,
and you can be anybody. And that's the same with the Stoics. You could be an emperor and a good Stoic, or you could be a slave and a good Stoic.
right, right.
So what they would say is, if you're the emperor, do the things that are, your duties as an emperor, right? If you're a slave, do your duties as a slave, right? So they would be concerned with the affairs of man insofar as I think it concerns your place, right? Your duty, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but I also think I mean, certainly Christians, but also probably Stoics, right?
Mm,
I mean, given look at how the fact that they rescued infants
sure. Yeah.
from
Right.
abandonment
That's a good point. Yeah.
suggests that they had a sense that duty included obligations of individuals toward individuals, right?
Sure. Yeah. Well,
Even people we didn't know.
the phrase cosmopolis, right,
Uh,
comes from the Stoics, right? Now it's been debased into this word cosmopolitan, which has all sorts of weird connotations. But in its original form, cosmopolis, right, is the cosmic city, right?
mm,
That we're all part of one cosmic empire of logos, right?
yeah, right.
Which is a
For that
powerful
reason, there's a
notion.
sort of fellowship among human
Right.
beings, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Well, so I know we're going long here, but I want to, if we can, maybe move to one last figure here and then contrast it some with Christianity. All the views that we've looked at see either looking at death and appreciating, looking at death and thinking about death as helpful, or like, so the Stoics, right, in terms of detachment, memento mori, right? Or we've looked at views where you're sort of transcending into a higher state, right?
Uh,
But accompanied with the belief that that's helpful to you now, right? To have that belief. A kind of a really different take, but there's some parallels. And this is jumping way ahead. So, but it's to look at Heidegger, right? Martin Heidegger is, controversial, very hard to understand in a lot of ways. But one area where you can sort of hone in on Heidegger is really to try to get a sense of what he's doing and being in time. Famously difficult work. Okay, but one thing you can definitely recognize, and this is the common interpretation, is that what he comes up with in the end is the view that being is time and time is being, right? So that temporality is reality, right? Transition, finitude, right? That is being, and that's reflected in our own being, right? So
uh,
Heidegger's view, right, is that the human person is where being shows itself, right? And what we find when we really look at the human condition is finitude and temporality, right? But that because of that problem we have with not being able to imagine our non-existence, right? We have a tendency to fall away from that, to reject the reality of our being, which is temporality and finitude, right? And that's when we fall into inauthenticity. Okay. Does that make sense what I'm saying? I mean, I know you don't agree with that view, but does that,
yeah, right. I
okay?
get it. Yeah.
Are you tracking me? Okay. So what we do then is we extrapolate the present into an eternal present, right? That we can occupy at some point. The problem with this, right, is it ends up denying us the reality, right, of being human, which is temporality and finitude, and that causes us to fall into inauthenticity, right? So that we have this kind of fake way of being in the world, right?
Hmm.
That in line with Nietzsche keeps us from really engaging, keeps us from really drawing on being, keeps us from really being able to relate to other people in a way that's includes solidarity, right? Um, the solution, right, as this great phrase is um, lucid resolution in the face of death, right?
Uh,
The solution is to accept your finitude, right? To embrace the reality that death is the end, right? And that in embracing that reality, right, you recover your being, you recover your authenticity, right? And that way you stop living this kind of fake life, right? And can really embrace your being, right? As moment to moment, right? Um, I think it's an interesting view, right? One of the things that's interesting about it, it is so. What would it be like if we were immortal physically? You know, like if like this part just went
yeah.
on and on and on and on and on and on, like we are in this world. Well, one thing I think you would become incredibly sad.
Uh,
Right? You
uh,
know, like because disasters are going to happen, and they're just going to see accumulation of disasters over time, right? Um,
well, I don't know. I guess, do you mean that we just don't get old and die, or do you
that's
mean
right.
that we don't
Yeah, we
age
don't get
and
old and die. Yeah, but we're still sort of prone to vice and things like
but you
that.
could
And
but you could
kill
still
somebody.
like get killed. Could
Yeah,
you
right,
like
right,
that?
yeah, yeah,
Right. So you're saying that because if you couldn't get killed, right, then obviously there wouldn't be very many disasters. There would be setbacks,
yeah, sure, sure.
but they wouldn't have the same kind of effect, right?
Hmm. Hmm. I
But
think the other thing though that would be weird is our ability to think about our lives as a story. I think would be kind of undermined a little bit,
yeah,
right?
there's
There's a
no.
there's a sense in which like the idea that there's an end of the story
Uh,
helps us to think about it as a narrative. And
and you have an
I'm,
idea of how
yeah,
long it's possible for that story to be dragged on,
right.
right? I mean, like you don't know for sure. Some stories are very short, right? But
Mhm.
and some of them are fairly long, but none of them are longer than 120 years.
Right, right, exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. And so it kind of frames our lives in a way, right?
uh,
That we can kind of see a process of maturation, right? And
Expectations of where we should be at some stage, and the
that's
ability to
right.
gauge ourselves, right? Our
That's
moral
right.
development
Hmm.
um,
Yeah,
on
and
the
so that
basis of that timeline.
yeah, right, yeah, and so that and you can also see decline, right? You can sort of see, oh, like like this part of my body's not quite what it was, and those sorts of things, and ultimately, in a weird sort of way, this reminds me a little bit of that Aristotelian statement, right? That I mean, this is being kind of generous to Heidegger, but that you call no man happy until he's dead, right? That we don't really know whether someone's happy until they've completed the course, is the way I would like to say it, and so that you can look, so that the man who's in his deathbed, right, if he's in such a situation, looks back on his life and says, "Well done."
Yeah, right.
Right. You
Now, of
know.
course, Christians, of course, we have this concept, right? Because
Mm.
except that declaration is given by God,
That's right. That's
right?
right. Yeah, I was thinking as I was saying it, "Well done, my good and faithful servant."
Yeah,
Right. But for Aristotle, I think it's important I think it's important that other men praise you. But he doesn't have an idea, of course, God praising you. And but also that sort of self, you know, yes, I have done well, right?
yeah,
Um, there's something kind of noble about that. There's also something a little bit elitist and arrogant about it too. But I think that's kind of how Aristotle rolls. But anyways, like, what do you think about some of those ideas as far as? So I've kind of given a generous interpretation to Heidegger, but obviously there's some critical things you could say about it
Yeah,
too.
right. Well, I mean, where I agree is that recognition of finitude is morally significant,
Hmm.
right? But I don't agree that that necessarily means recognition of an end to our objective, um, to the objective existence of the self,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So, for example, in Christianity, right, we have this idea that the life we're in now is the life we have. This is the life in which we're morally responsible,
Hmm.
um, for the conduct on which we're going to be judged by God in the end.
Right.
And there's only so much time.
Right. Sure.
Recognition of finitude here is also, I think, synonymous really with recognition of our created nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
Recognition of the fact that I don't have my being in and through and of myself, right?
Right.
I have it as given by God,
Hmm.
and so there's always this giver of being to whom I'm responsible,
Right.
and on the terms that He defines,
Hmm.
not those that I define for myself.
Gotcha.
Um, so I don't know. I think there's more than one way to sort of be aware of finitude, right? To
Yeah.
be honest about finitude.
I got you.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. It does. What do you think of the criticism pushed, say, push back here? It's that what you're doing there, right, um, is extrapolating um, the present and your desire for continued being into um, God, right? I mean, Heidegger's, I'm sure you've heard the onto-theological critique, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, that's his view that, yeah, that sounds good, what you're saying, maybe, that you can appreciate finitude and affirm um, the continuance of man, but that's only within a framework in which you've already distorted being and created a God.
I guess my response to that would be, I mean, leaving aside issues of miracles and all this kind of stuff that suggests to me some evidence that there really is such an entity.
Okay.
But leaving that issue aside, let's say you don't grant any sort of evidence, right?
Mm.
Um, I guess I might say the Judeo-Christian tradition, I think, recognizes the sort of intellectual improbability of this concept. Historically, right, this is a really actually odd view of reality when you think about this God beyond nature
Hmm.
that it is necessary being
Hmm.
and conscious and willing,
Hmm.
and it thinks and wills that which is other than itself,
Hmm. Right.
right? That's a huge philosophical conundrum,
Hmm.
and we recognize, right, that philosophically, even if we can make arguments for creation, right,
Hmm.
that's not a concept that people actually did argue for
Right.
until people to whom the idea was revealed
That's right. Yeah.
encountered them,
Hmm.
right? So even if in principle you could sort of lay out the philosophical bricks here,
Right.
it's really hard.
Sure.
It's not the kind of so the Heideggerian critique, right, would it seems to presuppose that the Judeo-Christian view of God uh, it is obvious somehow,
Mm.
that it's culturally obvious,
Mm.
and
Okay.
in fact, it's not.
So
It's
you're saying
hugely anomalous.
he's underappreciating, right? The um, I guess the uniqueness, the strangeness, the radical, character of Christian theism.
Yeah, if this was just a reflexive thing that human beings do, then everybody would do it
Mm-hmm.
cross-culturally, right?
But they
Now, it's
don't.
true that what you do have is people grasping at the sense of there being more than what we see,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
That you absolutely see
Mm-hmm.
cross-culturally, but the particular kind of answer that we give in the Judeo-Christian
Mm-hmm.
tradition, that's unique.
Yeah, gotcha. I gotcha. What do you think about? How would you respond to the claim of inauthenticity versus authenticity? You know that somehow when we affirm the immortal about ourselves, that we become fake. You know, and live in a way that's undermined, like we're kind of
Yeah,
undermining ourselves.
that critique only stands if in fact it isn't true that
Mm.
there's this immortal dimension, right?
Right. Sure. Yeah, but it's an important point.
Because yeah, I agree. If it's not true, if this is an illusion, if I'm wrong about all this,
Mm-hmm.
then the kind of life that I'm living is different from the life that belongs to me as an organism to live, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you argue by contrast, right? And this takes us back to that sort of pragmatic point
Mm-hmm.
that somehow human beings evolved in such a way, right? That that we have a complex social moral structure to
Mm-hmm.
that requires us to forego personal interests for the sake of highly complex abstract notions of sort of social good,
Right.
right? And if that's the case, then even there I would argue um, my authentic being as a human being
Mm-hmm.
seems to require that I labor under the illusion of the afterlife.
Interesting.
Does
It's
that
a,
make any sense to you?
sure, sure. Yeah. I mean, they're, you know, I mean, so Socrates, you know, says something similar, right? With the idea that maybe even if this is not true, it's better, right?
Yeah.
That I live this way. I think, you know, to really, you know, one other person who says something similar is Kant, interesting enough, right? I mean,
Yeah.
his view of morality is that, you know, you don't act for happiness, but he recognizes that for human agents, we need to believe that happiness and moral duty coincide, right? And that in order to have that belief make sense, there has to be an afterlife in which it can coincide,
Uh-huh.
and a God who ensures that they coincide, right? So, you know, God and the afterlife are postulates of practical reason for Kant. It's interesting. I think to really give a robust view, right? It would be great to sort of, and I think you can do this, flesh out an anthropology
Uh-huh.
in which we can recognize that affirming the existence of God involves the affirmation of our own human being, right? Where we see the affirmation of God as a sort of um, teleological outcome of our own flourishing. Do you see what I'm trying to connect it teleologically? Does that make
Uh-huh.
sense?
So I think for Christianity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just as I said before, recognizing that you're a contingent being,
Mm-hmm.
and that God Himself is necessary being upon which you depend for your existence, right?
Right.
Then it's part of the very definition of humanity to because we're rational, right?
Yeah.
To recognize this fact, to
Yeah.
recognize that relationship, and
Yeah.
therefore to conduct ourselves uh, to conduct ourselves as responsible to it.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. That's cool. Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of different perspectives here. Do you want to kind of give us a last word, kind of from a Christian perspective?
Well, from a Christian point of view, there's some weird things, right?
Mm-hmm.
That I think we need to recognize as a sharp distinction between anything
Mm-hmm.
else, um, including sort of a Stoic view, right?
Sure.
And that would be that in Christianity, there's the idea of the resurrection of the body.
Yeah. Big deal.
That's a huge deal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's very like there's it's an open question, really, exactly what the resurrection of the body is like, right? People have different
And halos,
speculative
man.
ideas.
Don't we have halos?
Yeah,
Or what do they call? What are they called? Is it Orioles or what? There's a strange term in the supplement to the Summa. Do you know what
yeah,
it's where he's? I can't remember.
yeah. Areola. I don't
Yeah,
remember. It's
yeah.
it's
I think it's what it is.
the that you see this depicted in some of the iconography when you see like the full body. It's like a
Uh,
halo, but it's the full body
Full body
thing.
halo. That's
You
cool.
just glow, right?
Yeah, yeah. I like that.
Um, but the so there's this idea of the resurrection of the body, and we don't really know anything about it except that it transcends the body in this glorified form would transcend somehow all those sort of negative things about the body in this life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so rather than materiality making us subject to corruption and decay and limitation,
Mm-hmm.
um, instead, the world having been sort of taken up into fire, right,
Yeah.
consumed by fire, the world is we're elevated to the point where we become our existence is now one of mastery over the material world. By contrast, of course, there's the resurrection of the damned, which is another condition entirely.
Yeah.
Maybe harder for us to imagine, right? Because we might describe that as a condition of perpetual decay.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you picture the in the story the picture of Dorian Gray, right?
Mm-hmm.
The picture bears the marks of the guy's debauchery, right?
Right. Right.
And it just decays and decays and decays. And I don't know. I
Yeah.
can't really wrap my head really
That's
around
interesting. Yeah. I've always
contemporary.
I've kind of conceptualized it as or imagined it as a body that is capable of being burned but not consumed.
Yeah,
That's
sort of.
kind of drastic,
Right.
pretty awful image, right? But yeah,
Sort of an inversion, say, of the reality of Christ in the Eucharist, right? Where
mm,
he can be eaten, but he's not really like he's not ever eaten but never consumed
right, sure,
is
sure,
the is the phrase.
yeah,
And
interesting,
yeah, so anyway, and who knows? I mean,
sure, right,
it's weird, but we have this idea, and this is the important part, that it's not just the mind, right?
right.
It's
That's
not
key.
just mens, it's not
That's
just
key.
nous,
Yeah,
but the entire soma, the
right.
entire organism
Mm-hmm,
that
mm-hmm.
ultimately is taken up into a share in the divine life.
Yeah,
And that is a truly bizarre idea. I'm going to admit that, right?
yeah, yeah. But it makes
But
sense. It makes sense anthropologically in a way, right?
it does in terms of our basic longings, right?
Sure, right, yeah, yeah. And one of the things that's bizarre about it, right, is you get the idea that I love the imagery in Revelations where you know the the heavenly city comes down, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, and it's there amongst us, and God is with us, right? In this new heavens and new earth. I mean, I think Rich, this is one sort of maybe weak points, maybe too strong a criticism, but because I think of our tendency to focus on the beatific vision, which makes, of course, good sense, to think about. We tend to maybe not spend enough time on the new heavens and the new earth, right?
yeah, I
And
agree.
and the fact of the resurrection, because I mean that's really what we're going for, right? Is the kingdom of the fully realized kingdom of God,
Right.
in which we will still have the beatific vision, right? But the final status, right, is really the kingdom.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. But I think one of the reasons why this happens is that we have to we have to do theology within a language framework,
Sure.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the language framework with which we have to work is some philosophical system.
Right.
Um, And so far, all of our philosophical systems have had some sort of limitation as far
Sure.
as really reconciling
Mm-hmm.
this relationship between matter and spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that we've worked with, right, has
Mm-hmm.
had some kind of limitation here. And so I don't think we really have yet sort of a metaphysical way of getting past this problem. The problem is, if we think of human beings as rational animals, right,
Mm-hmm.
it's our rationality that defines us specifically, right, as a specific, that's the specific difference,
Mm-hmm.
is our rationality. And so what's the fulfillment of the rational being? Well, it's knowing.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, knowing the highest truth, right, is
Mm-hmm.
the most fulfilling thing there could be, hence the beatific vision. And
Mm-hmm.
then we have this, the problem is, how do we imagine anything more perfect in terms of our own fulfillment than that?
Mm-hmm.
Where does the body fit in? Does the body add something that's better than the mind,
Mm-hmm.
or that's is more being than the mind itself, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's good. This spills into all sorts of interesting issues, right? In ethics and in anthropology, about whether or not contemplation is really the only end
Uh-huh.
or the ultimate end, right?
Yeah.
Like you can read. There's different interpretations of the Nicomachean Ethics on this very point, right?
Uh-huh.
Where some will kind of Platonic readers of Aristotle, right, will tend to instrumentalize all of the other goods except for contemplation.
Uh-huh.
You see what I'm saying, right? And you get a little bit of this feel in Augustine sometimes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there are places where he talks about you use every other good, right, but only enjoy God, right? That language
Uh-huh.
people out sometimes. I think there's ways to deal with that, but the uh, um, or the other interpretation of Aristotle, right, which is that contemplation is the ultimate good, it's the best good, but it's not the only good,
Mm-hmm.
right? And in fact, it's very rare and episodic and blah blah blah, right? With all those qualifications, but yeah, it spills into lots of different issues about human beings and human fulfillment and human actualization. What is it? Um, like you're saying, like what does the kingdom and the resurrection of the body add, right, to the human actualization? Is that correct? That's why you're
Yeah, right.
framing the question.
Right. And we could go around and around about that. That would be its
Sure.
own podcast, maybe. But
That's right. And we've got pretty long. We need to wrap up here. But can
yeah,
I?
but I think the reason we don't think about it as much as we should and maybe give
Mm,
it short shrift is just because we don't know how to talk about why, what it is about it that's so essential. But I think the
mm,
simplest answer to this question is that God seeks to reconcile the totality of his creation to himself.
mm.
And
Interesting.
that means both matter and spirit.
Mm,
It means the totality of the human organism,
mm.
because the human organism is both material and spiritual,
Okay. Mm.
right? And so he doesn't choose to leave behind the
Yeah.
dimension of
Yeah.
matter.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's an interesting way of doing it. I like that. That's a good. You've thought about this before, Rich.
Yes, I have.
Says Matt Factor theologian. That's a good answer. I like that one. Well, we should probably wrap up there with that answer. Last thought, comment. You want to wrap us up, Rich?
No, I think well, no, my last thought is just to remind us, in the rule of Saint Benedict, right? Benedict actually also talks about keeping death ever before your eyes,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's always influenced me. I'm always, it's good to remember that from time to time, right? To just be aware that we are in fact accountable.
Right.
Okay, so that's enough for today. Thanks for tuning in, and don't forget to give us a thumbs up, like, and subscribe, and share our content. It helps us a lot, and we really appreciate it.